Deal framework between Iran and 6 world powers announced in Switzerland last week is being hailed as historic, and the parties hope to have a final agreement worked out by the end of June.
This framework would cut off every pathway that Iran could take to develop a nuclear weapon. Iran will face strict limitations on its program, and Iran has also agreed to the most robust and intrusive inspections and transparency regime ever negotiated for any nuclear program in history. So this deal is not based on trust. It's based on unprecedented verification.
The deal, which is aimed at limiting Iran's nuclear program, would also benefit Iran. It would be allowed to keep its nuclear facilities open, although there would be strict limits on production and international monitoring would be in place. In return, economic sanctions on Iran would be eased.
We have stopped a cycle that was not in the interest of anybody, not in the interest of non-proliferation, and not in the interest of anybody, to one that will, in fact, be a gain for all parties concerned. And I hope that at the end of this process, we will all show that through dialogue and engagement with dignity, we can, in fact, resolve problems, open new horizons, and move forward.
But Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is attacking the agreement and warns it could threaten Israel's existence.
Such a deal paves Iran's path to the bomb. And it might very well spark a nuclear arms race throughout the Middle East, and it would greatly increase the risks of terrible war.
Later, we will have perspective from Iran, and we'll have a report from Israel as well. But we begin with Hilary Mann-Leverett here in Washington. She is a visiting scholar at Georgetown University, and she is the co-author of Going to Tehran, Why America Must Accept the Islamic Republic of Tehran. Welcome to the show, Hilary.
Thank you for having me.
Both the United States president and the Iranian president, they're both calling this a historic achievement. What is so significant about this framework agreement announced?
It's really the potential. There's not so much of a there to say that there's an agreement, but it's the potential. It's the potential, I think, particularly for the United States in our own interests to get off this incredibly self-damaging trajectory of never-ending war in the Middle East. The failed military interventions in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria. This gives us the chance to get off of all of that and to actually have constructive relationships with one of the most, if not the most important power in the Middle East.
There was quite a bit of detail that came out of the announcement by John Kerry, this framework agreement that was announced. Are there any winners and losers in what we heard, or is it, as the Iranian foreign minister put it, a win-win situation here?
If the parties continue to negotiate in good faith, and with mutual respect, I think it could be a win-win situation where the United States, again, could benefit from the potential to change its own policy in its own interest, to have more constructive relations with all of the countries, especially the Islamic Republic of Iran. And Iran, too, can modernize and improve its own nuclear power system without the world having to sneer behind their backs that they're somehow producing nuclear weapons and other nefarious activities.
One of the criticisms of this framework deal, and we heard this criticism here in the United States as well as from Israel as well, is that it does leave Iran with something of a nuclear program. The critics are saying the United States and its allies should hold out for a complete dismantling of the Iranian program, right down to the last nut and bolt, right down to the last screw. Is that realistic?
Well, no, because the only negotiated agreement you're going to get with the Islamic Republic of Iran is one that they want. The problem the critics have here is not with the agreement itself. It's with the system in Iran, with the Islamic Republic itself. What they want to see is a different government there. What we had under the Shah, a government that is very obedient to American interests and carries out what we see as our policy preferences. Then they actually might be happy with that government having nuclear weapons, as they were apparently happy and prepared to have the Shah have nuclear weapons, as they're happy to have or prepared to accept Israel with nuclear weapons and apartheid South Africa with nuclear weapons. The issue is not the nuclear program, even though so much of the attention is put on that. The issue is the system. And this is the central question for American policymakers. Can we accept in our own interests this fiercely independent Islamic Republic of Iran, align with it where we can, like against ISIS in Iraq and Syria, and perhaps even in Yemen against al-Qaeda there, and bracket the areas where we disagree, perhaps like Israel?
One of the people leading this criticism against the deal is, of course, the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. He's been fighting very hard to undercut his deal. In fact, he said that any deal with Iran's going to threaten Israel's existence, because here we have a country like Iran, which has threatened to destroy Israel, which has threatened to wipe the Jewish people off the face of the earth. I want you to take a listen to what he said on U.S. television over the weekend. There has been some pushback from Democrats. We'll hear from Senator Dianne Feinstein of California as well. But let's watch this first.
I'm not trying to kill any deal. I'm trying to kill a bad deal. And you say it's a historic decision, a historic deal. It could be a historically bad deal.
I think he said what he's had to say. And to be candid with you, this can backfire on him. And I wish that he would contain himself, because he has put out no real alternative.
Are they both making good points there?
Well, in some ways, I would hope that Senator Feinstein's remarks are prescient, that it could backfire on Prime Minister Netanyahu. Unfortunately, the record is he's been enormously successful here in Washington. He was able to set the stage here in Washington that we had to have crippling sanctions against Iraq that killed 500,000 Iraqis, half of them children. And when that wasn't good enough, he also testified to Congress falsely that Iraq had nuclear weapons and therefore we should invade and destroy that country. The success record of Netanyahu here in Washington is unparalleled. He may succeed yet again. What he's desperately afraid of, and what Obama really has to focus on, is the American ability, perhaps, to have a better relationship with the Islamic Republic of Iran, where we hear from Iranians themselves about their nuclear program, about their foreign policy, their national security strategy, and perhaps we work with it where we can, and again, we bracket where we disagree. To do that, instead of relying on him and his supporters to yet again sell us a false bill of goods that Iran has nuclear weapons. In fact, he's also been coming to Washington now for 20 years, saying that Iran was 2 to 3 years away from nuclear weapons. His track record is clear. It's been false, but successful. We'll see whether President Obama has the wherewithal to make the strategic case to Americans that we can choose a different path.
Well, we're hearing a lot of rhetoric against it from Benjamin Netanyahu, from members of Congress right now, and there's a lot of moving parts as far as acceptance of this deal by Congress here in the United States. But can Congress undercut this deal that is being negotiated between the P5+1 and the United States?
Absolutely. I mean, they can pass legislation, and they may be very close. My count is they probably have 64 of the 67 senators that they would need to override a presidential veto for legislation that would block President Obama's ability to lift sanctions. And without the ability to lift sanctions, why on earth would Iran sign a deal with us? So yes, the Congress certainly has the ability, and Prime Minister Netanyahu has many friends in Congress, not just among the Republicans, though he has made it somewhat of a partisan issue. He also has Democrats that are sympathetic with him, and I can clearly see a path for him to get the 67 senators necessary to override President Obama's potential veto.
Blocking sanctions. Can they also introduce new sanctions?
Yes, they could. I think their first priority is going to be to block his ability to go through with the deal by lifting any existing sanctions. And then if they're successful with that, we may see them impose more sanctions according to their narrative, to get Iran to do what we want them to do, which we know isn't going to happen. The goal of sanctions is to try to collapse a government, like the goal was in Iraq. That's what they're trying to do with Iran, not to ensure non-proliferation compliance, but to undermine the Iranian system as such.
Well, let's look at something that has been criticized, and that is that this deal, according to the critics, extends only to 10 years as far as the production of uranium is concerned, 15 years as far as the production of plutonium. And therefore, after that, Iran's going to be able to do whatever it wants to. Is that the case?
Well, Iran is one of the charter members of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and has been bound by international law, which has been an incredibly effective treaty. The ability for states to break out of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty has not happened. We've had one country that formally left it, North Korea, and they've pursued a program. Otherwise, the countries that have procured nuclear weapons arsenals, Pakistan, India, Israel, apartheid South Africa, they were not members of the NPT, and that's where we've seen the failure. What Iran is doing today is legal. What they would be doing under this prospective agreement would be legal, plus with more safeguards. And there's no sunset provision, which is what the critics put out there. Even if the increased safeguards end in 10, 15, 20 years, Iran is always bound by the NPT to never acquire nuclear weapons. And if they adhere to and sign the additional protocol, they will put themselves under even more restrictions that last forever. They don't lapse after 10 years.
So the NPT is open-ended, doesn't end at
That's
some
right. It's a
point. Right.
forever commitment.
Okay. Any word on when sanctions will be lifted?
Well, the Iranian interpretation, and we don't really know what happened behind closed doors, is that the United States has agreed for this simultaneous, comprehensive lifting of sanctions when Iran complies with its side of adhering to increased safeguards on its nuclear program. That seems to be a point of contention. The Iranians have interpreted it that way. The Americans have put out a fact sheet and other things saying, well, it's going to be gradual and pegged to various things the Iranians are going to do. It's going to be over time. We'll have to see what actually happens by July 1st. My thought is that we probably will see the action really happen in the Security Council. I don't think there's any real potential for the U.S. Congress to lift sanctions, but perhaps the Security Council can do so. That would take 5 minutes for President Obama. He could literally pick up the phone, call our ambassador there and say, either vote for or don't oppose a Security Council resolution lifting sanctions. It would be easy for him.
I want to get back to something you said right at the beginning of this conversation, that this is much more than a nuclear deal, isn't it? It does change the dynamic of the U.S. relationship with the Middle East as a whole.
It has the potential. If this is really done and President Obama really adheres to it and uses it as the strategic opening that it has the potential to be, that means we could for the first time in decades decrease our dependency on our so-called allies, particularly the Saudis and the Israelis, that for all Americans think they've benefited the United States, have done things that have been profoundly damaging to U.S. interests. In the Saudi case, to fund and arm Sunni jihadists across the Middle East, and in the Israeli case, to be overseeing a perpetual, never-ending occupation. We could lessen our dependency on those countries, not dump them as allies, but lessen our dependency and have more constructive relations with all the countries. That could be as profound as what Nixon and Kissinger did when they opened to China and realigned our relations fundamentally in Asia.